Hello everybody, this is International Master Sam Shankland, and today I would like to continue my little series on how to play against these unambitious white d4 systems, where they try to sort of get an easy position to play and not really have to think too hard, but solid and easy to play. So last time we looked at the moves bishop f4 and bishop g5, which sort of took the position in one character. But here we're going to look at the move e3, which takes the position in a very different character. Basically, I'm going to show a position which goes exactly the way white wants. Something like this. Say castle, castle, b3, knight d7. And some get to a position like this one. Now f4. White's idea is very simple. Lift all the pieces over to the king side and make a big attack, and black's kind of some trouble because there's not much he can do about it. So this is exactly what white wants from this position, but we're going to do our best to not let this happen. So going back to the beginning, I think in this position, if you try to do the same plan as before, it probably just won't work. Something like this, b3, knight c6, bishop b2, let's say. The whole idea of queen b6, it just loses its point entirely because this bishop is on b2 protecting d4 and the pawn's already on b3. Most importantly, white hasn't moved his c-pawn. So what I think you should do is, well, okay, if they play b3, probably play c takes d4. And then after e takes d4, play bishop g4. Let's say something like bishop b2, knight c6, knight b2, e6, bishop f3. And you see in this, or I guess the real point is white would really like to put his bishop on d3. There's two problems. One, it runs straight into knight b4 in a lot of cases. But more importantly, I think this knight on f3 is pinned and it's going to have a hard time getting to e5. So I think that's why the bishop sort of belongs on e2. If they wanted to put it on d3, they could put something like a3. But that costs value the whole time. As you'll see in a position like this one, if white tries to play, like let's say black plays queen c7, if white plays c4, black can always take and play a move like rook fd8, and this hanging pawn structure should give black some pretty reasonable chances. Okay, it's not in a better position by any means, but it gives him good chances to play for an advantage if his opponent tries to play sort of unambitiously. And it makes white really think, unlike in most of these positions they'll really find in the sort of passive d4 openings. So c4 usually doesn't cut it, but it's hard to find another plan because the e5 score is so well covered. For example, let's say white plays sort of an unnatural looking move with queen to e1. His idea is to try to get to e5 as soon as possible. I think a very important theme is to trade this bishop for the knight once it's starting to go to e5. Because really, it's kind of annoying when the knight gets there, and your bishop is the light squared bishop is always the worst piece. So while you don't want to necessarily just play bishop takes f3 out of the blue, if white breaks the pin and then is starting to put a knight on e5, it might not be a bad idea. So here, let's say I move like knight to g4, and the whole point is to control the e5 square. And if white plays h3, knight to h2. Okay, this rook on f1 is attacked, knight takes h2 is forced, bishop takes h2, and bishop comes back to d6. And I really don't think white has much of anything in this position because he doesn't have this trademark powerful knight on e5, and his bishop on b2 is very passively placed. For example, and okay, black will be able to play for e5 in some cases. Let's say queen e3. Maybe now you might want to even play bishop f4, but I think a move like e5 seems pretty simple. Takes, 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 queen takes, takes, takes. And while black has an isolated pawn in this position, you have to think to yourself, is the pawn on d5 really any weaker than the pawn on c2? If white's pawn on b3 were back on b2 and the pawn on c2 were on c3, then I would say white's probably a bit better if he can, okay, as long as he's not losing a piece right away, because he'll be able to blockade this c-pawn and have a pleasant position without any weaknesses. But at this point, I think the pawn on c2 is just as weak as the pawn on d5, so I'll say how the game could play out. Something like rook fd1, rook a c8, bishop e2, and rook d8. Okay, well actually let's not play bishop e2 because that hangs the pawn. So maybe actually let's play rook d8 first. Bishop e2, rook c8, just to show. A position like this one, it's not so easy to see how white's going to continue, because this pawn on c2 is such an annoyingly weak point. For example, rook d2, maybe black can start to bring his king over. Okay, you've got to be careful for rook takes d5, so I guess we'll play f6, so that after rook takes d5, we can take on c2 without having to fear for the safety of the knight on e5. And after a move like f6, I don't think white really has much of anything. Maybe he'll play f4, knight g6, and this just seems like black's pretty comfortably equal. And well, okay, there's a relatively high draw threshold in this position. I think that black certainly can play for, I mean, if white makes some mistakes, he'll be able to probably get an advantage. So, I think that's sort of typical. Although black certainly doesn't have to rush with e5 either. He can maybe play a move like rook a e8, the idea of trying to push e5 through, and not have to trade queens, get some activity on the dark squares for his pieces. So I think that this position is really just fine for black. So black probably, it's not only just fine, it's really solid. It's sort of the thing that white wants for his position, a solid position where it's easy to play. Black's position, he'll play for e5. It's solid and it's easy to play. It's the exact same thing in that sense. And this will kind of maybe put white players and in a spot that they really don't like to be in. So I think it's kind of important to remember to trade off this piece. The bishop is on g4, because it's like, if you look at the position I showed at the beginning of the lecture, let's go back to that. Sorry, it's kind of like working backwards, but if you get a position like e6, bishop d3, bishop d6, castle, castle, e3, c5, bishop e2, knight d7, knight d2. I think I might have put the knight on c6 in the original, but I could be wrong. If you look at this, the biggest problem for black is that this light-squared bishop on b7 is just so terrible. And the fact that we were able to trade it off for the knight on f3, and then subsequently not let the knight into e5, really changed the position and made it a lot better for black than it normally would be. So, I think that's the best way to play against this system, is to play a move like c5. And, okay, if white plays bishop d3 first, you can still play something like knight c6. Eventually, if they play something like this, you can certainly take and play bishop g4 and force them to clarify this way. There's a lot, and now they've really given up the possibility of playing their system, and a London system would make no sense now because black got his bishop out in a favorable manner. So I think that these are totally fine for black. So the next option I'd like to look at is the stone wall, e3 here. Knight f6, let's say bishop d3. White's plan in this case is to play f4 first, and then knight f3 to e5. In all of these systems, the real point is to use the e5 square. But the difference in this one is that you can't really avoid it, because white will play f4 first, so you can't protect the e5 square enough. So I think in this position, black should play c5. And let's say white plays f4. Knight c6. Now, if knight f3, maybe bishop g4 is annoying. So let's say white plays c3 first. This is sort of the stonewall leg setup. And I think here that one of the best ways to play is to play g6. Something like knight f3 takes. White always wants to take back with the e-pawn to open the e-file, and when he puts the knight on e5, if it ever gets traded, after f takes, he'll open this bishop up very nicely. And now a move like bishop to f5. So I think this is a strong move, because at first people might say, well, you're doubling my pawns, and you're giving my king less options. But really, I think that even if black decides to castle kingside, let's say something like bishop g7 here, knight e5, is black really going to get checkmated right now? I don't think so. It certainly doesn't look like it. But more importantly, I think black does get access to the e4 square, and then he'll be able to kick the knight with f6. I don't think he should play this way. I think, well, I mean, this is a plan now, but I don't think he should have castled so early, although it seems okay anyway. I think a move like e6 now makes some sense. And if bishop knight e5, let's say queen c7, and black might even castle queenside in this position. With the open g file and the e4 square available, it looks like he really has some good, rich counterplay coming. So I think often white won't take this, but now if we can trade this bishop off, this position changes a lot. So we've got to realize here, white's whole point was to play knight e5 and try to generate attack. And while here a knight on e5 will certainly look pretty, I'm not sure how much attack it can really generate after the white squared bishops have been traded and this diagonal has been closed. Let's say move like e6, knight e5, and, okay, for the sake of argument, bishop g7. There's other ways of playing, of course, too. But if you think about it here, look ahead. What is white's plan? How can he improve his pieces? How will he be able to generate some sort of initiative? It's really not easy to say because the standard plan of rook f3, rook h3 doesn't do anything with this pawn on g6 and the bishop on g7 because we've gotten rid of this weakness on this diagonal with the bishops getting traded. So I think it's really hard to figure out how white's going to improve his pieces. Say something like bishop e3, castle, bishop f2. What should black play? So think to yourself for a second here. How is black going to best repel white's threats? Okay, so I think the best move is knight e4. You've got to figure out this bishop on f2. It just played bishop e3 to f2 and is about to go to h4. So we can play knight e4 and we control the square now. And if knight d2, I think even the move f5. And if you see, we've got a semi-symmetrical structure, except I think we can make a good case that the bishop on g7 has more of a future than the bishop on f2, although the bishop on g7 isn't that great right now. The bishop on f2 will be terrible forever. And if white ever takes on e4, this pawn structure should favor black because he has a protected passed pawn on e4. Meanwhile, if black ever decides to take, I mean, okay, I don't think taking e5 is the best move here, but if he does, white does not have a protected passed pawn, and if black plays a strong move like b5, trying to cut down on the c4 break, I think black has every reason to expect to have a slight advantage. So, although I think it's not even necessary to take the knight on e5 just yet, a move like queen c7 might make some sense as well. Black will play for b5 to cut down on c4. So I think this is totally fine, maybe even a bit better for black now. So going back to bishop takes f5. So bishop takes f5 and castle e6. Looking at direct, you really think about this position, you see that the doubled pawns don't mean that much because it gives you better control of the center, and white traded off his best piece. His whole plan is sort of based on using this d3 bishop to attack, and we traded it off. So I think this is a very strong idea. And we're also using the fact that white committed to this knight e5 plan so early. Like if you go back to a previous lecture that we did on something else, if we saw a position like this one instead, so knight f6, bishop f4, c5, e3. If we did something like this here, it would be very different. I think this is clear. Now this position I think is clearly better for white because we haven't committed to f4 yet. So this bishop is very active on f4, while it was very passive on c1 previously, and eventually white has ideas of playing f3, e4. So this is a different plan. But once white has committed his pawn to f4 already, I think it makes more sense to play bishop to f5. So really, if you think about it, all of these systems, going back to this one with Stonewall one with e3, they're all basically the same thing. White's trying to use the e5 square to find a position that's really easy to play, where he doesn't have to be a grandmaster to find all the best moves. But but the problem with all these different systems is that you have to play very differently against each one to avoid getting into the kind of positions they like. But I think in this case, it's not so hard. I think people will get trapped much more by the bishop f4 line. But here, as we saw, black looked to have a pleasant position by playing moves like g6 and bishop f5. So I think that will conclude first half of my series on this on combating these passive d4 tries. My next half will be on if black is someone who plays the Indian system, so move like knight f6, knight f3, and okay, we'll look at e6 and g6 here, and moves like bishop f4, bishop g5, and show how those are different. So thanks. Until then, this is Sam Shankland signing off.